Of the U.S.-led so-called war on terror has been a wave of anti-terrorism legislation in other countries. One of them is Ethiopia. Ethiopia has never been known for freedom of the press. And with the disputed general election back in 2005, ongoing internal conflicts with separatist groups, and the powers that be keeping a wary eye on the nearby Arab Spring, the government in Addis Ababa has been cracking down on the media. Its primary weapon is an anti-terror law that it passed in 2009, which has led to the sentencing of 11 journalists, sent dozens of reporters into exile, and has forced countless others to practice self-censorship. The Listening Post's Nick Muirhead now on the Ethiopian law that blurs the line between terrorism and journalism.
Under Ethiopian law, the woman who wrote these articles is a terrorist. Riot Olemu was jailed in 2011 under the country's anti-terrorism law and charged with planning and conspiring a terrorist act, possessing property for terrorist acts, and participating in the promotion or communication of a terrorist act. She was sentenced to 14 years in Ethiopia's infamous Kaliti prison. 2 of the charges have now been dropped and her sentence commuted to 4 years. But there is little doubt as to what landed her in prison.
She was mainly interviewed about her writings. Why did she write for certain online publications? Why had she taken photos of certain slogans in the city and quote-unquote distributed these? So all the interrogations basically related to her activities as a journalist.
I don't know which specific work of her offended the government, but I know that most of her articles criticize the government with a concrete evidence and a concrete facts. As you know, Ethiopian government has no tolerance to hear any criticism.
In 2009, former Prime Minister Meles Zenawi's government passed the Anti-Terrorism Proclamation. In August last year, Zenawi died, but the legislation survived under his successor, Hailemariam Desalegn. To date, 11 journalists have received harsh prison sentences under the law. 6 in absentia, 5 have been jailed. 2 more are in prison awaiting trial, and according to the New York-based Committee to Protect Journalists, will most likely be sentenced under the law.
After all this persecution the Ethiopian independent media have faced, most of us have been exiled, there are a significant portion of us in prison, and the government has not still relented on its persecution, but still people write.
Much of the reporting on Ethiopia these days happens at a safe distance. According to media watchdogs, 49 journalists fled the country between 2007 and 2012 to get away from a government that doesn't want to talk about this issue. We made several interview requests but were denied. The government did tell us that those in prison are there for their terrorist activities and not for being journalists. With convictions stacking up, however, terrorism and critical journalism in Ethiopia are starting to look like one and the same.
The anti-terrorism proclamation is dangerous for journalists in 2 different ways. First of all, it's the letter of the law that's overly broad, in particularly Article 6 of the proclamation, which makes normal journalism a punishable offense. And the second point is the way that the law is being implemented.
It was born out of the U.S. global war on terror. One of the things the United States did when United States declared the war on terror was look into the legal structure of partner countries, how their anti-terrorism law is designed, how effective it is, how cooperating it is. And now what happens is most countries, like Ethiopia, when they encountered U.S. assistance to beef up their legal structure, what they did was they used the new opportunity to squash dissent and free speech in their context.
It's not only local journalists suffering under the long arm of the anti-terrorism law. In 2011, Swedish reporter Martin Schibbye and his cameraman were embedded with the Ogaden National Liberation Front, a separatist group the government deems a terrorist organization. Schibbye says they were both wounded during their capture by government troops, but instead of being treated in a hospital, for the next 4 days were forced to act in front of government cameras in order to provide evidence that will be used against them in their trial.
We under gunpoint are forced to say things on tape. They bring in 2 civilians, dress them as rebels, and put them in the same frame as us, give them guns. At one point, I get to talk to the president of the Somali regional state, and he tells me on a satellite telephone that he's not satisfied with our performances during today's filming. So tomorrow we will have to do it all over again.
Yeah. Sit properly. I have a sit properly. Yeah, just
The next day they kind of hire the stakes, and Abdullah Verar, the vice president, he arranges a mock execution where I am forced to walk towards the desert horizon, and behind me I have 45 Ethiopian army soldiers who unsecures their guns, and they say, now you have to tell the truth or we will shoot you. You will die here in the desert and we will blame the rebels. And then they fire in the bush next to me. And from the shot I fall down on the ground and realize that I'm still alive. And then a film camera comes up and another interrogation takes place.
The reason we came...
The so-called confessions filmed in the desert were aired on state-run television, but that was only the beginning of their legal woes.
The entire proceedings really were wrought with fair trial violations. They obviously were being tried in a country which they did not speak the language. They were often in court without an interpreter. They were often in court without counsel because their counsel wasn't informed of the changing in court dates. And in the end, they were convicted to 11 years in prison.
It was not me and Johan on trial, it was journalism on trial. It evolved into a battle between the idea of journalism vis-à-vis some Ethiopian security concept.
After 15 months in custody and persistent diplomatic pressure from Sweden's foreign minister, Martin Schibbye and his cameraman were pardoned and sent home. For the Swedes, their ordeal was over, but the same cannot be said for the Ethiopian journalists they left behind.
If we had been local journalists, we had been shot in the desert. Second of all, yeah, we shared the same sentence, we shared the same prisons, and we shared the same conditions as many of the local journalists like Reot Alemo and others. But there ends the similarities. I mean, I'm here in Sweden now in my apartment, she's still there in Kaliti. That's a huge difference.
One clearly felt by the journalist's fiancé, who despite the risk of breaching the anti-terrorism law, not only spoke with us, but has continued Alemu's work while she remains in jail.
She's trying to be a voice for a voiceless. As a journalist, her goal is mine too. That's why I work hard to publish her collection of work. I'm proud of her. I'm proud of her.
For now, the Ethiopian government is using its anti-terrorism law as a tool against dissent. And journalists are either collateral damage in the so-called war on terror, or the government considers them the real enemy. Either way, it doesn't bode well for journalism in Ethiopia.